podcast. All right, we are live, and today's topic is on separation anxiety. We were hoping to cover this yesterday with Smriti, but yeah, but she had some connection issues, so we shifted the topic to today. And we already have a lot of questions actually that have come in about separation anxiety. So wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about the concept of separation anxiety. What does that look like? And yeah, and maybe start answering some questions. So so separation anxiety, when you talk about children, it's actually a really natural and healthy part of their development. So it primarily ends up being about just the stress or the tension that a young child feels when their caregiver is not around them. So there's actually a really cool experiment which is also built around the concept of separation anxiety in some ways. So it's called the strain situation, and it primarily looks at the different kinds of attachment patterns that occur between children and their caregivers, which are usually their moms, but not always, and the kind of relationships that form there. So if the child expresses his anxiety by crying when the mother comes back to the room, that's usually a healthy indicator of the fact that the child is able to express his emotions to the mother and is feeling a healthy amount of attachment, but is also comforted when the mother comes back. But that's not always the case, and there are also many dysfunctional patterns of attachment where when the mother comes back, the child may retreat, the child may ignore her, the child may show a lot of possibilities exist. And all of these translate obviously into our everyday adult relationships as well. So within our adult relationships, often if some of these things are still lingering, and there have been differences or distances in the way that we've dealt with separation, or that particularly makes us anxious, that obviously manifests in our adult relationships as well. So that's something that ends up happening, and yeah. Uh, all right. So I am going to start us off with some questions which I see are here. So, so someone's already asked us that how do you cope with separation anxiety, especially when it comes to your partner? And firstly, I can imagine that if someone is experiencing separation anxiety per se and just feeling really scared and really worried every time their partner is leaving, then yeah, I think it might be a good thing to firstly start defining um, what are the things that you would want to do, what are the things that you would want to people you would want to spend time with, and just how you want to spend this kind of time. I think those could be good ways to just, I think, on a practical and a pragmatic level, start figuring out how you want to spend this time. And that sometimes definitely helps with the fear if you're feeling really scared. Um, if this fear is something that's also permeating into other domains of your life, if you're just generally feeling scared and stressed out all the time, or there are a lot of negative thoughts that are coming in and you don't really know what to do about it, then I would also strongly suggest that you seek a mental health consultation if that's something that's generally worrying you, because then it also may not be just separation anxiety, but there may be other things at play as well. um, but I think it's also, in the context of relationships, it's also a good idea to have this conversation with your partner in the first place, right? Like, understand where that fear is coming from. Does your partner feel the same way? Address why you're feeling this fear. What is it that your partner adds in terms of security? And why do you think that you're not capable of giving yourself that security when your partner is not around? So those could definitely be some ways in which at least you can start the conversation. At least the topic is out there, as opposed to stuck within you and you don't really know what to do about it. So, and it also helps us feel a little more in control of just the situation, of how we're feeling. So, all right. And someone's asked us that what are the underlying issues, if any? I think similar to what I was answering in this question, that there definitely is a possibility that a person may generally be feeling anxious or maybe feeling stressed, or there may be a lot of things that are happening at a mental health level which we may not be conscious of. So, if you're constantly feeling stressed out or fearful, it's a good idea to just get a mental health consultation. But apart from that, I think in terms of underlying issues, like I'm not a huge fan of the word issues, but I think similar to, I mean, I think from a psychodynamic perspective, if there are things that have stayed in the way that we've interacted with our parents, or uh, or in the way that we have interacted with just caregivers around us, I think that definitely translates into how we're going to interact into adult relationships as well, right? They end up sort of being the schemas of how we think relationships function. So we as adults often don't know any other framework for how any relationship works or functions, except for the one that we've learned as children. Right? And so as adults, we have to put in a lot of conscious effort and work to even try to edit that particular format or that particular framework for relationships. But usually, it just ends up yeah, it usually ends up just being the safest or the most easiest way of how to understand that give and take of relationships, or to understand what safety looks like in relationships, or to even understand what the language of love looks like in relationships. Because I think for so many of us, love in relationships ends up being a language where you constantly need that person around, where it's hard to do anything without that person, and which I think also then ends up leading to some amount of fear and anxiety when that person goes away. So, and I think it takes a lot of time and it takes effort to find that middle ground or that balance where you're also in love with your partner and expressing love to your partner and sharing all that you need to about your life, but you also have an identity of your own outside of the relationship, and you feel able to give yourself that kind of support and strength when you need to yourself, in or with the presence of your partner. So it's important, I think, to just, I think, remember that while so much fusion occurs in relationships, right? Despite that, it's really important for us to keep remembering and keep thinking through what are the aspects of our own identities in relationships. And someone's asked us a question that how can I make my brain realize that I'm not 3 years old anymore and it's okay to be alone? And that's a tough one because, yeah, I think at some level, all of us are, some parts of our brains, everyone's brains, are stuck in our childhood or are stuck with the memories of things that have already happened to us. So I think I would say that comfort, that child within that you feel you can sense or is affecting your life right now, don't move away from it, and and I think figure out a space where you can start addressing some of those memories that are coming up. So that can be journaling, that can be talking to a therapist, that can even be talking to someone who you really trust, or but yeah, but like an empty space of sorts, which helps you at least start thinking through what are the memories that come to mind. So the ways in which this manifests on an everyday basis is very benign, right? It happens through an immense amount of homesickness, which is it's really hard to figure out how to separate from our parents if we have to go to college or if we have to go to boarding school, or if college slash boarding school have been things that we're constantly subjected to, then it becomes even harder to leave our parents. In relationships, if our partner is constantly traveling, it's really, really hard to accept that or be okay with that. So those definitely end up being some of the ways in which we see separation anxiety occur on a day-to-day basis. And yeah, and I think it ends up being quite hard to manage that when it's happening all the time. It just ends up being another manifestation of anxiety, right? Where you're just having an immense amount of negative thoughts and you're feeling scared all the time, you're feeling stressed all the time. And all of that can be definitely, I think, very difficult to manage all other aspects of life with. Yeah. Um, okay. And Hmm. Someone's asked us that how do you handle anxiety in a sense where you're afraid you'll say the wrong thing, which will make you feel bad, and hmm, I guess so. That actually is often what the anxiety is about in social situations, isn't it? We're often scared we'll say the wrong thing, or someone else will feel bad. Like I see all of these as strands of thoughts that are happening because of the anxiety, that we're always worried that the thought in mind is something that that'll come true, or that's something that we won't be able to control. So I think my advice in a lot of these situations ends up being pretty basic, but also uh, I think a lot of these solutions ends up being basic, but it ends up being more about figuring out concrete ways in which we're doing this for ourselves on an everyday basis, right? Like every self-help book, every person that you speak to will tell you that, oh, you should trust yourself more, which makes sense. But I think it ends up being more about how you're making sure that you're making yourself feel trusted and good about yourself on an everyday basis. And that can happen through a lot of ways. You can do it through affirmations for yourself. You can do it with finding more gratitude when you go to sleep. You can do it with uh, walking through situations that make you feel particularly uncomfortable or particularly anxious. Those are definitely some ways in which this can start happening. So I think that helps with how you're managing your anxiety. Um, how to deal with fear of failure is what another one of our participants today has asked. And I think, yeah, like again, similar to any other fear, I feel like uh, often it helps when we think through a fear that we're really catastrophizing and think through what do we think we will lose if this does indeed come true, and and what do we think are the ways in which in which we can still stay what we want to, right? Like I like this do uh, do want be diagram that a lot of spiritual as well as psychological books talk about, where they say that if you think through any want or any desire that people have in life, it may be something like, oh, I want to be more successful, or I want to be in a good, loving relationship, any of those wants, right? And we're always scared of failure and all of these things. And if we look at what we eventually want to be if we get any of these things, we believe that if we're in a better relationship or a better job, or have our partner around us all the time, all of these will lead to maybe more happiness, more contentment, more safety. are there ways in which we can also feel happy, content, and safe, even in the absence of these things? What if we start this entire loop, this entire logic, by starting to feel a little more happy, content, and safe? Know that any of those things are things that are within us, that we can access, that are a part of us, and not things necessarily that other people are giving to us. So those definitely end up being some ways in which I think we start gaining a little more control over our emotions. I think it's one kind of logic that maybe works for some people and doesn't for others. Um, so yeah, some people are sharing some really difficult situations as well. Some who've been taken away from their family at a very early age. Um, some who want to share affection but they're not being able to share that affection with their partners. And yeah, I'm firstly thank you so much for, as always, trusting this space with sharing your stories. And I think, yeah, I think journaling honestly ends up being a way for me to often understand how to figure out really complicated memories for myself, especially if those memories are coming back again and again. I do think that it's really hard to do relational work or attachment work on yourself by yourself. So, therapeutic space does make sense if you want to consider doing some of this work for yourself. So, it does help to have someone listening to you to figure out how to do this and what to do, and also I think help you figure out the blind spots in the way that you are looking at your own attachment patterns, which is really hard to do without someone else's help. And another participant here is talking about heartbreak and how that also becomes something that's really hard to do and really hard to figure out, and it's hard to let go of that. I think that's really profound point actually, right? That it's so hard to to let go of memories of things that have already happened. It's so hard to let go of people. It's so hard to let go of people whom we even know will come back, but we're not really sure. So the things that we have to necessarily let go of because we should, and the things we're supposed to hold on to, but may not as much. In all of these scenarios, we're trying to find that, that perfect point or that sweet spot of sorts between being attached to people still, but also finding the right kind of attachment. I used to find that concept funny sometimes. That it's so hard to find exactly the perfect way to love someone, and I guess it's yeah, I guess it's hard. It's definitely really hard to find that for ourselves. But again, like I think a question that does help me is what is that serves you, and that is something that I think I personally, at a personal level, keep going back to as a question. That what is something that would serve you in a relationship, or or in the way that you interact with other people? That I think is a good question to begin with, because I think even in relationships, it ends up being about us, what we're giving to ourselves, what we want to give to ourselves, what we want to give to the other partner, who we want to be in the relationship. Those are great questions to start a relationship with, or even work through like a long-lasting relationship with. That that yes, there may be things that have happened in your past. There may be things that you're still working through in life, but who do you want to be right now, and what are the ways in which you can get there? Sometimes I think we struggle to even find that clarity about what that ideal self would look like, or what are the things that we aspire to in our relational capacity. And and I think I always also keep encouraging people to have these conversations with their partners because I think that alone is such a powerful, affirming force within relationships. When we have some of these difficult conversations with our partners and share this with our partners. So, yeah, I think that also definitely really, really helps in how we're thinking through relationships or what we're understanding within the relationship. So, yeah, I think those are definitely some of the things that I've been thinking about while looking at the questions here today. And there are some more that we've gotten in terms of questions. Hmm. Okay, there's a really interesting question. Another one of our users who said that this person also often feels separation anxiety when their partner is napping. Even that feels like anxiety. And yeah, firstly, I think that sounds really stressful. And I can also understand though, actually, because it almost feels like you're left alone and awake in the conscious world. And you can no longer access your partner's thoughts and emotions. And that's hard to deal with and can definitely provoke some anxiety. But again, I think separation anxiety for me ends up being something that takes a while to unpack as to why we're feeling that way, what is making us feel abandoned, and what is making us feel really scared, what is the fear of. And I think just answering those questions for ourselves becomes a good starting point to at least understand where these fears are coming from. And someone's asked us that can therapy be helpful for it. I think absolutely. This is work that does take some time, and yeah, and it does help when when we work on these anxieties with our partners and with each other. So that definitely helps as well. Um, yeah, I think so. Just to quickly sum it, I think a lot of these anxieties end up being about what we've experienced as children. Some of these anxieties can reflect other things that are happening in some of these anxieties can be reflective of other mental health concerns that may be occurring. So, if you're feeling anxious or stressed out or in a low mood all the time, or if you're just feeling too scared to leave the house or get out of the house, I think those are definitely things that you should take a harder look at and figure out what's happening. So, speak to a therapist or speak to someone else whom you can, and those can definitely be good ways in which you can start having this conversation and start figuring out what is it that's making you extremely anxious. So yeah, that's all that I have for today. And thanks, guys, and thanks so much for listening and for sending all of these questions. I hope I've tried to answer as much as I could, and all the best.